This case is remarkable for many reasons, also remarkable personally to me. For students of law, it would be remarkable because there is hardly any aspect, any crucial aspect of criminal law, procedure, and the law of evidence, as well as special statute, where it is located in the larger scheme of things. There's hardly any aspect of this which is untouched by this case. It is also a very, very interesting narrative of investigative procedure. From the point of time where the trial court convicted all four who were put on trial for this case and handed out 3 death sentences, to the Supreme Court, where 3 were acquitted totally of terror charges, and there was only 1 conviction. You can imagine the analysis, counter-analysis, correction, and arguments that must have taken place between the trial court and the Supreme Court. But I will begin on the 12th of December, a day before Parliament was attacked, because personally to me, it is significant. On the 12th of December 2001, I had just finished arguing the Tada appeal of Devender Pal Singh before a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court. As hearings went, I was very pleased. I appeared for Devender Pal Singh. In fact, the bench was asking the state very awkward questions. This is the same Devender Pal Singh about whose death penalty there has been so much news, and finally it was commuted, I think, last year. He was also unwell. And I had more or less thought that the case was in the bag for me. The hearing concluded around 4:30 in the evening on the 12th of December, and I had decided to take the next day easy. And as I was strolling past Shankar Market, I heard from the shopkeepers that Parliament had been attacked. And my first feeling was, right then and there goes Devender Pal Singh. And true enough, Devender Pal Singh's judgment, although the senior most judge actually acquitted him, saying that there was no evidence. The only evidence against Devender Pal Singh was a confession which had not been corroborated at all, a Tada confession. The other 2 judges who upheld the conviction and also upheld the death sentence given to him by the Tada court referred to this kind of things that were happening in the country, more especially the Parliament attack, saying that these were cases where proof beyond reasonable doubt cannot be made a fetish, and a confession, if voluntary, should be taken to be truthful without independent corroboration. For those of you who are students of law, you must realize that there is another reality to the legal process which cannot be comprehended only by looking at the statute or looking at precedent. There is a politics that is going on, and as luck would have it, while upholding the Pota confessions in the Parliament attack case, great reliance was placed on Devender Pal Singh's judgment. So this is a curious dynamic that takes place. Personally, for me, it was a very, it's unforgettable and often enjoyable experience. For one, I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with KG Kannabiran, no more with us, but he was here at the trial and he appeared for Shaukat. And his was always a riveting and a company full of humor. This case was also remarkable for the outpouring of brilliance. The kind of people who stood up for the accused in this case were Shanti Bhushan and Ram Jethmalani. The important thing for them was not merely that, whether they personally thought somebody was guilty or innocent, although I'm sure that entered into it in a way. But this was the first Pota trial. We had had a background of fighting against Tada, and to re-establish due process in those difficult times was very, very important. So we saw the likes of Ram Jethmalani and Shanti Bhushan in the matter, who gave everything to it. Shanti Bhushan, I know for a fact, spent 16 hours a day because he was so passionately involved in the case, rejecting all other briefs and concentrating on this. And I have no doubt that his arguments against the manner in which confessions are recorded by police officers had a great deal to do with the fact that eventually the Supreme Court discarded the two confessions in a case like this. Now, what was the Parliament attack case? On the 13th of December, 5 men in a white ambassador went past the Vice President's gate into Parliament. One funny thing is they had a sticker which looked like a Home Ministry sticker, imitated a Home Ministry sticker, but it had some strange words on it. It said, "We hate all Indians. India is a very bad country, BED. The idiot, EDIET, Vajpayee, WAJ, etc., etc. We will kill them." Words to that effect. But this car with the sticker was allowed to pass the Vice President's gate. And there was some kind of a scuffle. The security men were alerted. The result, there were all these 5 were gunned down. There were 3 bodies outside gate number 5, 1 body outside gate number 1, 1 body outside gate number 9 of Parliament, and a huge, amount of explosives were eventually recovered. The local police, as well as the special cell, this happened around 11:30. The local police and the special cell came there around 12:30. An FIR was registered at the local police station. The white ambassador car, because it was flashed on TV, a certain person who had originally owned that car showed up at the Parliament Street police station saying that he was the original owner, and he had bought it from a number of people, and he had in turn sold it to a few people. The investigation began with 2 crucial leads for the police. One is all the dead men had cell phones. The second, all of them had identity cards of some Zansa web city, which was later found to be a fake institute. Or there was an institute, but these people had nothing to do with that institute. All of them had one number, 984411489429. I still remember the number, as the contact number. So what the police did was immediately check the call records of that number, and they found that the telephones found on the dead people had been in touch with this number. And this number in turn had been in constant touch with 2 other phones just around that day. So they put the other 2 phones on surveillance. According to them, one of them was SAR Gilani's and the other was Shaukat's. So that was the beginning. But there are a few things which still remain unexplained about the phones. For instance, some very strange things. In the middle of that scuffle and that fight and that shootout, it appears that 2 of the men who were shot dead, the intruders, were changing the SIM cards in their phones just during that period. And for what purpose, nobody understands, because there was this body of the phone, the IMEI, showing 2 different SIMs around 11:29, 11:39 between that, and because both of them were brand new SIMs, none of them had expired. How anybody had the time to do this of course remains unexplained. The other thing for which we still don't have an explanation is this SIM number of Afzal, which was eventually attributed to Afzal, 9811489429. They brought a witness to say that he had sold the SIM card to Afzal on the 4th of December 2001. But in the call records brought by the police themselves as evidence, this number was shown to be in operation even in November, late October, November 2001. This has been brushed aside. When I come to one aspect of the matter, which is, expediency versus rule, sometimes courts do tend towards investigative expediency. Some answers are not forthcoming. Whether they are crucial, whether they would make a difference to the case itself, is not easy to say. But some of these things are brushed aside in matters like this. So then, the surveillance of these two telephone calls with which that number on the identity card, I must tell you that that SIM was never recovered. 89429, the SIM which they said belonged to Afzal, was never recovered. But call records showed that phone as having been in touch with two other numbers, as I said. So it is the claim of the police that these two phone numbers were put on surveillance. There was a conversation which one of those numbers had with somebody in Kashmir, which they said was Jilani's number. Jilani's, of course, was a registered number, and he accepted that number. The other telephone conversation was of Shaukat's wife with Shaukat. And according to the police, this is what led them to Jilani and Shaukat's wife. And on Shaukat's wife's information, they reached Shaukat and Afzal in Kashmir. But the story did not turn out to be as straightforward as the police wanted it to be. For one thing, you see, POTA, unlike many other laws, had a whole chapter on interception of telephone conversations. And in my view, it was a good thing. The general law in India until then was that telephone conversations are relevant to a proceeding, provided you establish the identity of the voices to the satisfaction of the court, and you establish that there was no tampering. So it was a broad general rule on the admissibility of intercepted conversations or telephone conversations. The identity of at least one of the speakers, and that the tape, if it was a tape recording, was tamper-proof. POTA had a whole chapter on interception of communications, and in fact it said that if the specifications in that chapter were not followed, the intercepts would be destroyed and would not be used in any court of law. That is, within 10 days of being tendered in evidence, at least 10 days before being tendered in evidence, the origin, the authorization for the intercept, and the genuineness would have to be established, would have to be put into court. Otherwise, the conversation intercept would have to be destroyed. It also had provision, Section 43 of POTA, also had provision for emergency interception, because they realized that the whole statute was on terror, so they realized that there can be, an immediate, there can be an emergency, there can be urgency, and you may not be able to wait for the Home Secretary's permission. So there was a provision to get a here and now authorization for interception. None of this was done. So two bits of conversation were brought in with the charge sheet, saying this is Jilani's conversation with his brother, where he's supposed to have said something like, "Ye Delhi mein kya hua, ye chhe zaruri," or something in Kashmiri. And the other is a conversation of a woman with a man saying, "Do bande aaye the, kahan ho, kaise ho, chotu," etc., which according to them was Shaukat's wife talking to Shaukat. This, in the interim, the Delhi High Court held on this very count to be inadmissible because it did not conform to POTA, but the Supreme Court said no, the whole thing can be seen again at the trial. And in the eventual analysis, these telephone conversations were both read by the Supreme Court. It is, in my view, another concession to expediency. But as things turned out, they felt that the conversations, even if read, did not impute any criminality either to Shaukat's wife or to Jilani. That's a different matter. But it does give an interesting insight into when you want to record confessions by the police, then you impose POTA. But when you want to intercept conversations, when you want to, what is it correct for, when you want to intercept conversations, you choose not to apply POTA, and the argument was we had not applied POTA on the first day, therefore we were not required to conform to any of these requirements. That is a, that is a paradox, and that is, in my view, an unfair position to take. The other thing about these conversations is, one of them, the entire tape was for 78 seconds, whereas the recorded conversation was only for 40 odd seconds. And there were other conversations on that tape which nobody explained, which is one reason why the High Court said this is not reliable, but the Supreme Court overlooked that also. But as I said, in the event, they considered it to be, they did not think that there was anything criminalizing. So the order in which the arrests were made, according to the police, was they taped these conversations. They checked out that one of the numbers was a regular Airtel subscription, namely Jilani. So they arrested Jilani from his house on the morning of the 15th. And then they arrested Shaukat's wife. And from Shaukat's wife, whom they arrested around 1:30 in the afternoon of the 15th, they got information that Shaukat and Afzal were in Kashmir. And based on her information, they arrested Afzal and Shaukat near Sopore in Kashmir. But in this story too, there were several gaping holes. One, they claim to have arrested Shaukat's wife Navjot around 1:30 in the afternoon of the 15th. She is supposed to have been the source of the information about the whereabouts of Shaukat and Afzal. However, Shaukat and Afzal had been arrested early morning that day around 10 o'clock, several hours before the police even claimed to have reached Navjot Sandhu. So this is the investigation in a case of this nature, which is also one of the reasons why there were so many acquittals. Having arrested them, what was the brunt of the police case? There were 2 POTA confessions. Since many of you are students of law, I want to tell you, or perhaps you know yourself, that traditionally under the Indian Evidence Act, no statement made to a police officer is admissible as evidence. Not of an accused, not of a witness, not even police statements. It's all out, it's completely inadmissible in evidence. An early departure was made in the NDPS Act. I'm not getting into that now. A significant departure was made in Tada when a confession recorded by a DCP would be admissible against the accused as well as the co-accused. There is a history to this. I'm not currently getting into this. POTA retained that provision as far as the accused, the maker of the confession, went, but did not extend it to the co-accused. This is as far as the special laws were concerned. When Tada was challenged in the Supreme Court, the Constitution bench, by a majority of 3-2, upheld this provision of police confessions. 2 judges still said this is completely unacceptable in the Indian context, but the majority did so, I don't know, well, once they uphold it, I don't know whether the word reluctantly makes any sense, but there was a degree of reluctance saying, yes, but we must trust our own policemen. After all, in other countries, in the US, in the UK, statements to police officers are admissible. Why should we not have it, particularly when the country is going through terror and all that? And this is a special provision that is needed. But 2 judges still said this is unacceptable. It's violative of Article 21, violative of the Equality Clause, and the police can't be trusted in terms of confessions that they record in cases they are interested in prosecuting and securing a conviction in. Now, compelled self-incrimination is what is outlawed by the Constitution, not all self-incrimination. Compelled oral self-incrimination has been outlawed by the Constitution, but there was an implicit understanding that when the police brings a statement as a self-incriminating statement, a certain compulsion is virtually read into it, deemed to be compelled. This was slackened in Tada with the consequences that I mentioned, but because there was an outrage. Actually, the Indian judicial conscience has always been extremely uneasy about police confessions. They have upheld it, then those laws have been repealed or they have lapsed, then again they try and recognize it. It's a very, very uneasy. It's not as though they are able to wholeheartedly accept it. On the other hand, they sometimes feel impelled to permit them, but clearly it's on an understanding that there are strong arm methods used, and without these strong arm methods, perhaps you cannot control terrorism. There is that uneasy feeling. On the other hand, there is also much heart searching over it. This is the way, we have taken many tosses and turns with this. But Pota restricted this to the co-accused without having the words which Tada had, and as against any co-accused, conspirator, etc., tried in the same trial. Now, the regular law of evidence also permits statements of co-accused, confessions of co-accused, although they don't have the status of evidence, Section 30 of the Evidence Act, but they may be taken into consideration. So the traditional law is it does not qualify as evidence under the Evidence Act. No conviction can be based only on the confession of a co-accused, but if there is other evidence which, if believed, would lead to a conviction, then to get that additional assurance, you may look at the confession of a co-accused. This was the traditional position. So an interesting legal question arose in the Parliament attack case. First, whether the absence of the word can be used against co-accused, conspirator, etc. You must tell me if I'm being too dense. Whether the dropping of those words was significant as statutory intent to keep these confessions out of operation against the co-accused. And assuming that to be so, would these confessions then be at least as relevant as they would be under the normal law? It was a very, very interesting question. In the event, the High Court and the Supreme Court both categorically held that the statute meant not to use this, and if it was not to be used, it was not to be used in any sense. You can't go back to the normal law of evidence to try and bring it through the back door. This is a very, very, very significant opinion. Both of the High Court and the Supreme Court, they were unstinting in their opinion that this can simply not be used against the co-accused. The play of special versus general came up in several ways in this case. One is how to interpret this special law on confessions with newer wording, more truncated wording. The other thing was, you have a general law of conspiracy. Under the Indian Penal Code, a conspirator can be in most circumstances punished in like manner as the main actor, 120B. Pota had a main section who said whoever does any act or thing, it had 3 requirements: whoever does any act or thing with a certain intent of either undermining Indian security, sovereignty and so on, or to strike terror in a group of people, with the result. So there was an intent, and there had to be an act, and that act had to have a certain result for it to be a terrorist act. Then there were other sections for aiding and abetting such an act, conspiring to do that act, facilitating such an act. So 3.1 was the act itself, definition. 3.2 was punishment for doing that act. 3.3 was aiding, abetting. 3.4 was harboring, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, you have the law of conspiracy, where the conspirator for the mere fact of conspiracy can be punished as the main actor. Then you have Pota, where the main actor, there is a specific punishment. It could be death if death is caused, or life if there's destruction of a certain order. And then you have a separate section punishing conspiracy. So the question arose in Afzal's case, since he was not on the spot, he did not do any act, can he be treated as having committed the terrorist act which of course resulted in the death of 7 persons. So if you believe that, so death was a competent punishment for that act. Or because he was not there on the spot, whether it, so can you say that the 3.1, the 3.2 will not apply to him and he was a mere conspirator for a terrorist act? And if he was a conspirator, you punish him under 3.3 of POTA, where the maximum punishment is only life? Or can you fall back on 120B to say you must punish him as the main actor? This was another extremely, extremely interesting aspect of the case. And the Supreme Court eventually, by a very, very interesting piece of reasoning, said, no, you have a special law, you have it for the good or for the bad. If you have the special law, and they also said, because you have a special law, you have truncated due process. So if the law says conspiracy can only be punished with life, then a person who was not present and did not do any act or thing cannot be treated as the actor, can only be punished as the conspirator. Then you can't fall back on the general law to impose the death penalty on him. So in two significant ways, the Supreme Court said, once you have said the general law is ousted, what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. So you've ousted the law of evidence to bring in police confessions. Then you can't fall back on the law of evidence to bring what the statute does not permit you to do, either by way of reading it against the co-accused or by way of imposing the death penalty. These two, this aspect of the Supreme Court judgment is something I would want every student of law to read. Not merely because I agree with it, but because of the discussion of the case law and the discussion of the syllogisms used, the examples used are very, very illuminating. Now, having said this, nevertheless, when it came to the question of interceptions, the Supreme Court said, because what was the specious argument for not following POTA on interceptions? They said, just then, such a huge thing had happened in the FIR, we had not added POTA. So since we had not added POTA in the FIR, we were not obliged to follow the requirements of POTA with regard to interceptions, which we had to carry on that very day. But if ever there was a terrorist act, this was one. I mean, there was nothing hidden, or there was nothing, secret, or there was nothing so... it was not a conclusion that you had to arrive at with some extremely sophisticated reasoning. If ever there was a terror act, this was a terror act. So, and there was a POTA ordinance then. The act only came in March, but there was a POTA from October 24. So you had an ordinance which permitted interception, emergency interception. You choose not to follow that act. You choose not to, and the argument was we had not added POTA in the FIR. Why? Because it's such a draconian law that we had to think before adding it. We did not want to, so this, they tried to make a human rights argument for this, which in my view was absurd. Because you use POTA, you record confessions. So when you want to record confessions, you add the sections. But when you have to follow something, you don't. Anyway. But anyway, this argument was upheld eventually in the Supreme Court. But the High Court, as an interim measure, when the trial was going on, we challenged these interceptions, saying they are not in accordance with POTA. And we're not merely... See, one thing is, this is something I want you all to think about. With the kind of technology you have, anybody can virtually tape anybody without knowing whether there's Amar Singh or somebody. Everybody seems to be able to tape everybody else. If you cannot govern this by technology, is it worthwhile at least governing it by ruling it out of use? What is the point of having a procedure for interception if material can be brought into court even without adhering to that procedure? Is a question that's well worth thinking about. There are, of course, judgments of two kinds. It's a different thing. It's a detailed legal discussion. One is, even if illegally procured evidence, if relevant, can be used. That is one stream of cases. The other is where guilt itself depends on a certain possession. Then, if there is any statutory prescription about search regarding that possession and that is not followed, such as in drug cases, then that evidence cannot be used. In any case, our early success in having this entire thing declared illegal interception, that advantage was lost because eventually the Supreme Court read it. But as I said, that it was not, because the nature of the conversation was such ex post facto that it did not necessarily lead to the inference that people who had spoken knew what was going to happen to Parliament. So on that extremely strict reasoning, 3 of the 4 were acquitted. Before I come to Shaukat's acquitted, because there's a common misunderstanding that Shaukat was only given a reduced sentence. That is not the case. Shaukat was acquitted of all terror charges and he was convicted for concealing the design to wage war in India. This waging war, the discussion on waging war in the Supreme Court is also worth reading. Because there are riots, there are demonstrations, there are violent demonstrations, there are political demonstrations, there is political violence, there are terrorist acts. Do all of these ipso facto automatically constitute waging war on India? There's a very interesting discussion tracing the law from the late 19th century or mid 19th century about what was the original British concept of treason. That is, the person of the regent, the person of the king had to be protected. Then what was the colonial understanding of waging war? Then there is a very, very interesting judgment of 1951, although given by a British judge who was still in office, about a mutiny in Bihar, which happened, I think, in 46 to 47, where the reasoning was it is not merely the amount of arms or the manner, quo animo, why have people assembled is the issue, where the mutineering policemen caught hold of the armory and fired at the forces when asked to surrender. The Patna High Court in Mir Hassan Khan held even this is not waging war, because unless you have the intent to seize state power or seize any aspect of state power, mere potency of violence or nature of violence is not sufficient to render something waging war on the state. So there is a difference between insurrection, terrorism, and waging war, which the Supreme Court recognized. However, they said that this particular act did amount to waging war because the purpose was to strike at the essence of Indian sovereignty, namely the Parliament. But not every terrorist act would automatically mean because you're questioning the state, therefore waging war. But this particularly, because if they had seized control of the building, or if they had taken hold of the legislators, parliamentarians, and if they had dictated terms to them, then it would be virtually like directing state power. So it is the choice of the attackers that led the Supreme Court to believe that this was waging war. And concealing waging war, and in a strange circle, the trial court, which had originally, now there were 4 accused actually, I have not spoken systematically, I should have said. There were 4 accused because the 5 died. So through these telephone conversations, they reached Afzal, 89429, Shaukat, Jilani, and Shaukat's wife. So these were the 4 who were put on trial. The trial court, when it was even charges were argued, saying there is really nothing against Shaukat's wife other than this conversation. Trial court had framed an alternate charge, either the regular charges of poto, waging war, murder, etc. Alternatively, the intent to conceal the design to wage war. She was eventually convicted only, and she was acquitted of all other charges, convicted only under this design to conceal the waging of war and given 5 years. Eventually, she was acquitted both by the High Court and the Supreme Court. But as events turned out, in the ultimate analysis, the Supreme Court acquitted Shaukat of all other charges and convicted him under this section 123, saying he everything about him, that he was moving around with Afzal was explainable because they were cousins. That, he was seen at various places, but he had not ever, there was not one telephone call between the deceased men who were killed in Parliament House and Shaukat. He was not seen anywhere buying weapons, procuring anything. His movement with Afzal could be explained by the fact that they were cousins. There was a probable explanation, and there's a very, very detailed discussion of what is circumstantial evidence, saying any circumstance that may not be one raised by the accused, but if it's consistent with his innocence, then that should be read. So he was eventually convicted. Of course, there again, Mr. Shanti Bhushan challenged it, saying he was never charged with this offense of concealing. So this was not an offense which was a minor offense. There is a notion of a minor offense contained in a larger charge. I'm not getting into that. But that is what he was convicted of. In the discussion now, the evidence was of two kinds. One, the two confessions, Pota confessions of Afzal and Shaukat, in which there are stray references. Jilani also said this, and Shaukat's wife was also aware of what was going on. Then there were recoveries. They said Afzal, three things. They said Afzal recognized the dead men. Of course, this is a controversial thing because up until the Parliament attack case, any statement to the police in custody, including that of identification, was ruled out of evidence. But the Supreme Court held that Afzal's so-called recognition of the four dead men was admissible. So to this extent, the Supreme Court has deviated from precedent until then. Then there were shopkeepers and others who remembered selling cell phones. I told you one of them was slightly suspicious because he said he sold it in December, whereas the phone had been in use from November. Then there were people who had sold silver nitrate powder, and the man said that he remembered because it was such a large quantity. Then the police case was that there was a mixer grinder found in Afzal's house, which had pieces of explosives, and the landlord who had housed these five men who died, who claimed to have seen Afzal with them. So this was the nature of evidence other than the confessions. On the confessions which had been accepted by the trial court and the High Court, although the High Court said that they could not be used against the co-accused, which is why the High Court acquitted Jilani and Shaukat's wife. The Supreme Court really had, in fact, that it is a complete indictment of the wisdom of police confessions. You must read the judgment for that. In a case of this kind, Justice Reddy and Justice Navlekar said, why police confessions? When you have a magistrate, and according to you, a person is willing to confess, and that provision is there, why police confessions? And they dealt with this logic of how in other countries they have confessions to police officers admissible as evidence. Why not in India? Was answered by saying certainly not in India, because given the track record of the police, given the human indictment of human rights groups of police behavior, they certainly cannot be trusted when it comes to confession. And the court said, well, a larger bench has upheld these provisions, so we can't say anything about it, but we would think this extremely unwise to give the police this power of recording confessions. This was in fact quoted and read in Parliament when there was a demand to bring in Pota-like provisions again, and which is why in the UAPA there is no provision for police confession, but there are other laws in India like Makoka which permit it. The interesting discussion on confessions is the Supreme Court said there was very, very stringent tests. One is they imported Miranda-like standards into. They said, if you are not given your custodial rights, then you cannot rely on a confession made in custody. Those custodial rights are not only what have been specified by the Supreme Court in D.K. Basu, but there are also statutory rights both in the CRPC and in Pota, that is right to access to a lawyer, right to have access to the family, legal advice, a whole lot of these things which the police frankly admitted. They said, we never told them that they had any right to consult a lawyer. We never told them that they could meet their family. we never told them any of this. The Supreme Court said in the absence of this kind of compliance with custodial rights, the confession would become suspect. Second thing is, POTA has this requirement that, I mean, it's a strange requirement. You don't take the man to a magistrate. Although even magisterial confessions are really, the way they are recorded and the truth that emerges from seeing judgment after judgment of magisterial confessions, I would have issues about those too. Any self-incriminating statement by which an accused does not stand at the trial, in my view, should not be used. But that's my personal view. POTA said as soon as a confession is made, that confession along with the accused must be sent to a magistrate, and if the accused has any complaint, he should make it to the magistrate. So the Supreme Court asked, and rightly, if you're willing to take him to a magistrate afterwards, why don't you take him straight away to a magistrate to record the confession? Where is the need for all this rigmarole? Now, the Supreme Court that continued police custody will make a person balk at telling the magistrate that he did not wish to make a confession. This is quite sympathetic to reality. What is the situation in custody? Whether such a person would speak out at the trial before the magistrate saying he confessed under pressure, but if he was to go back to police custody, then he's not going to speak out before the magistrate. So they ruled out Shaukat's confession on just the ground that he had no access to a lawyer, he was not told by the magistrate. The magistrate did not assure him that if he spoke out, he would not be sent back to police custody. Therefore, the fact that Shaukat did not even tell the magistrate that this confession, so-called, was under pressure, could not be used against him. Likewise for Afzal. So both Afzal's and Shaukat's confessions were thrown out by the Supreme Court. So there were three levels at which the Supreme Court objected to the confession. One, lack of custodial safeguards, like access to a lawyer, etc. Two, what they considered was inadequate compliance with the requirement before the magistrate, particularly as to police custody, assuring him that he would not go back to police custody. These, they said, were completely, non-negotiables. In addition, they said that the tone and tenor of the confessions, which also we challenged, we said, which man? Shaukat's wife was expecting a child. There is a confession saying, quite unnecessarily, my wife was in full know of everything. So the argument was, which man would voluntarily drag his wife's name into a confession? If it was voluntary, this is unlikely to be part of that confession. All these unnecessary details implicating A, implicating B, etc., etc. So the Supreme Court said these were all very weighty arguments, but because they were throwing out the confessions on, violation of statutory safeguard, they were not entering into this. But as a scheme, if you look at that judgment, it's a complete indictment of the manner in which the police record the confession. One, they have no access to lawyers. Two, they have no idea, they can't speak out against the confessions because they don't know whether they're going to go back into police custody. And three, what is put in the confession can also be looked at by the court to say, is it likely that such a confession is truthful? Is it likely that such a confession is voluntary? And they restored the twin tests of a confession which had actually collapsed into one during the Tada years, lasting and others, that a confession has to first be voluntary. If it's established to be anything other than voluntary, it has to be thrown out. Even if voluntary, it has to be truthful. Now, how will you look for truth? There has to be some broad corroboration in material particulars. Of course, I don't think that it is followed as scrupulously as it ought to be. But after having said all this, the Supreme Court, of course, there may be a particular case in which a man may be sent back to police custody. So some of these dilutions can be confusing for lower courts. The other 2 or 3 aspects I just want to touch on. One is electronic evidence in this country, there is absolutely no clarity and no discipline how electronic evidence is to be preserved, how computers. Now, the laptop, they say they seized from Afzal. It was lying in the special cell, and some fellow down the street who sold computer parts was asked to come and look at it and give a report, and that was the first report, and after that, it was just lying the way it was lying. The idea that data is all mutable was not fully clear even to the judicial authorities dealing with the matter. In the event, the CFSL was asked to look at it nearly a month later. The file showed that the computer had been accessed on the 18th of January on a day when it was supposed to be lying in the Malkhana. This was pointed out to the Supreme Court. But as I said, in some aspects of the matter, expediency, saying that matter like this, somebody must have just checked it. You see, there is no somebody must have just checked it, because every access to incriminating material, mudda mal as it called, must be explained, particularly electronic material, because almost everything on a computer is text editable. So evidence was led to show this. So on aspects such as these, on aspects such as confession, how to appreciate a confession, the Supreme Court really, made quantum leaps. On an understanding of the special law versus the general law, as I said, that when the special law itself restricts something, then you can't fall back on the general law to expand that scope to the detriment of the accused. The Supreme Court was categorical. In, however, recognizing certain investigative expediencies, such as they did not comply with POTA procedures for interception, that aspect was not taken as seriously as we would have liked the court to take. On electronic evidence also, the Supreme Court said you have to prove that there was tampering. That part of the Supreme Court judgment has now been overruled in a later case, saying that the certification under Section 65B of the Evidence Act of Electronic is absolutely mandatory. Some aspects of regular criminal law have been diluted, like identification while in custody. Afzal's identification of the 5 terrorists is after all a custodial statement, but that was used against him. Then on what is discovery and pointing out, this has of course been, this is the last bit, then I'll finish, then you can have questions. See, all statements to police officers are ruled out at the threshold. However, Section 27 of the Evidence Act says if a fact is discovered pursuant to a statement made by an accused in custody, so much of that statement which is attributable directly to that disclosure can be led in evidence. So this is as far as discovery goes. Independently, there's a provision under the Evidence Act, Section 8 Evidence Act, which says the conduct of an accused is relevant. Conduct of a party to a proceeding, that includes an accused. Somehow this conduct has come to mean a very strange notion called pointing out. So they say an accused in custody is pointed out to something. So he points out to a place and something is recovered from there. This pointing out is very, very dangerous because it does not have the safeguards of Section 27, that there is a statement and somebody has to stand up and say, this is what he said, it's in pursuance of this that I have discovered, this is not required. This pointing out is, does somebody just come and point like that? So this pointing out how it has emerged is very, very strange. But there is a 1987 judgment of Justice Chinnappa Reddy, which in my view is what has led to this extreme widening and the blurring of the distinction between a discovery and pointing out, saying that even if the accused does not record a statement leading to a discovery, the fact as spoken to by a policeman that he pointed out to something is nevertheless relevant. In my view, that runs the danger of disguising a coercive recovery, or even a recovery which may not be attributed to an accused, which may not really be from the accused, as something which can be attributed to an accused. So this various shops that Afzal led them to shop A, shop B, the explosives where they got silver nitrate powder, etc., etc., that a policeman says Afzal led me to the shop, as corroborated by the shopkeeper, has been treated by the Supreme Court as a pointing out. This does have, in my view, although the Supreme Court relied on earlier judgments, this has some dangers for custodial coercion or at least manipulation of records. But as I said, this is not, the Supreme Court merely expanded on an earlier judgment. I have found time and again in Gujarat, I've seen cases, but there is no evidence. They just say the accused pointed out, this is the hotel in which we sat and hashed the conspiracy. What kind of evidence is that? The hotel is anyway there. So this is really the policeman setting up a story saying the conspiracy was hatched there. So this pointing out is a pernicious thing. And all that the Evidence Act says, the conduct of any party is relevant. So for it to get magnified into this pointing out, as a criminal lawyer, I have found it capable of great misuse. Then the traditional view that there cannot be joint disclosures, if they attribute joint disclosures to two accused simultaneously, then it cannot be evidence against either, was diluted by the Supreme Court in this case, saying in some cases it may be possible to attribute it to one or the other. So there are some aspects of criminal law which I feel have been some safeguards which have been slackened, others have been tightened. So the law on conspiracy, the law on confessions, the law on waging war has been greatly clarified. Law on circumstantial evidence, that all of this, two courts have sentenced him to life, to death. And the Supreme Court held Shaukat completely innocent. Please don't go away with the impression that merely his sentence was reduced. He was acquitted of all terror charges, all conspiracy charges. Yes, he was convicted of concealing the design to wage war, implying that he knew that something was afoot, even which we challenged, saying he was not charged with it. So circumstantial evidence, Supreme Court is very, very stringent. But some other aspects of criminal law, I feel that was really a concession to expediency. Afzal was sentenced to death for murder and for waging war. But under Pota, the two sentences of death of the trial court and of the High Court were removed by the Supreme Court. He was only sentenced to life. Of course, I mean, the small comfort if he was to be hanged eventually, that's a different matter. But legally, it is significant. I think that's all I have to say. If you have any questions, you can ask.